What's up, y'all? Welcome to the Nerdy Professor Podcast, where we talk about everything black, bold, and beautiful. I am your host, the Nerdy Professor, and today we're shifting our focus to the Civil Rights Movement and how they resisted oppression. In the mid-20th century, America was at a crossroads with racial tensions at an all-time high and change just around the corner. This time period honestly reminds me of one of my favorite animes, Code Geass. Now, Code Geass is set in an alternate reality where the Holy Britannian Empire rules over a vast portion of the world, including Japan, renamed Area 11. Non-Britannians, specifically the Japanese, face systemic discrimination and oppression under Britannian rule. This mirrors the real-life segregation and the disenfranchisement experienced by African Americans during the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement was a blend of grassroots activism and strategic leadership spanning from the mid-1950s to the mid-1960s. Ordinary people were fueled by their unwavering determination to challenge the status quo. The Civil Rights Movement utilized a variety of strategies and tactics to challenge systemic oppression. Understanding these strategies is crucial for appreciating the effectiveness of nonviolent resistance, legal challenges, grassroots organizing, and the use of media in affecting social change. These strategies continue to resonate in contemporary social justice movements globally, highlighting their enduring relevance and impact. The anime protagonist Lelouch v. Britannia acquires the power of the Geass and leads a rebellion against the Britannian Empire to liberate Japan, aka Area 11. He did this to secure the rights of Japan's oppressed population. This mirrors the grassroots activism and organized resistance against racial segregation and injustice during the Civil Rights Movement. Okay, so nonviolent resistance was a central pillar to the Civil Rights Movement. It drew its inspiration from Gandhi's philosophies. This strategy emphasized peaceful protest and moral persuasion as powerful tools for social change. This is a lot like the abolitionist movement. Nonviolent resistance sought to expose the moral contradictions of segregation and discrimination. By refusing to retaliate against violence or hatred, activists demonstrated their commitment to justice and equality. The philosophy of nonviolence not only challenged systemic oppression, but also appealed to the consciousness of the nation and the world, fostering solidarity and support for the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement was driven by visionary leaders whose strategic approaches and unwavering commitment to justice played pivotal roles in shaping its course. This is similar to the anime's protagonist Lelouch. His journey involved a bunch of ethical dilemmas as he leads the rebellion. His decisions often required sacrifice and tough choices, reflecting the moral quandaries faced by leaders in the social movements. Similarly, leaders and activists during the Civil Rights Movement grappled with ethical decisions about strategy, nonviolence versus self-defense, and broader implications of their actions in their communities and society. Rosa Parks, often hailed as the mother of the Civil Rights Movement, lit a spark of defiance that ignited the firestorm for change. So, on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks boarded a bus in Montgomery and took a seat in the colored section. When the white section filled up, the bus driver demanded that Parks and 3 other black passengers give up their seats. Parks refused to give up her seat, and that action would catalyze the Montgomery bus boycott, which would eventually help dismantle Jim Crow laws. Her refusal to surrender her seat was not merely an act of tired feet, but a bold declaration that enough was enough. Parks was arrested, and local black leaders, including Dr. Martin Luther King, E.D. Nixon, and Joanne Robinson, formed the Montgomery Improvement Association. They did this to coordinate a boycott of the city's bus system. So on December 5th, 4 days after Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, the MIA organized a successful one-day boycott of the Montgomery buses. The boycott was then extended indefinitely until their demands for desegregation were met. On November 13th, 1956, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled in Broder v. Gale that segregation on buses in Montgomery was unconstitutional. This landmark decision marked a great victory for the civil rights movement. For 381 days, the African American population of Montgomery, Alabama did not ride these buses. They created carpool options for people to get to work. They walked each other to and from where they had to go. All in all, it cost the bus system about $3,000 a day for 381 days. That's a lot of money. Martin Luther King Jr. was another prominent figure during this time. Dr. King was born on January 15, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. He grew up in a middle-class family, deeply rooted in the African American Baptist Church. King was exposed early to the realities of segregation and racial discrimination. He graduated from Morehouse with a bachelor's in sociology in 1948. He attended Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, where he earned the Bachelor's of Divinity in 1951. King went on to earn a PhD in systemic theology from Boston University in 1955, which would bring us to him moving to Montgomery, Alabama, and starting the MIA. So from the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 to the March on Washington in 1963, he was a beacon of hope and justice. Dr. King emerged as a central figure of the civil rights movement, renowned for his eloquence, moral courage, and advocacy for nonviolent resistance. His philosophy of nonviolent resistance inspired millions and propelled the civil rights movement forward. In 1957, Dr. King co-founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, aka the SCLC. It was a prominent organization dedicated to nonviolent resistance and civil rights reform. Under King's leadership, the SCLC organized several impactful campaigns. The Albany movement in 1961 to 1962 aimed to desegregate public facilities and register African American voters in Albany, Georgia. The Birmingham campaign in 1963, which challenged segregation in Alabama, leading to clashes with law enforcement and pivotal media coverage that influenced the Civil Rights Act of 1964. There was also the Selma Voting Rights Campaign in 1965, which saw marches from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, demanding voting rights despite brutal repression that ignited national outrage and ultimately led to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Dr. King led the SCLC from the time it was founded until he died. The SCLC coordinated boycotts, marches, demonstrations, and played a crucial role in raising awareness of racial injustice and advocating for legislative change. Despite Dr. King's assassination in 1968, the SCLC continues the mission of social justice and economic equality through grassroots organizing, education, and nonviolent activism. Among the everyday people, the unsung heroes of the civil rights movement was Medgar Evers. Evers was a pillar in the civil rights activism community. He fought for equality all over Mississippi. He was a field secretary for the NAACP and spearheaded voter registration drives across the state. He tirelessly investigated racially motivated crimes, and on June 12, 1963, in Jackson, Mississippi, Evers was shot by a white supremacist in the driveway of his home. His wife found him and took him to the hospital, and during that time, they initially refused Evers to be admitted, but his wife explained who he was, and they eventually admitted him into the hospital. The last words of Medgar Evers was "turn me loose," as he sat up in a hospital bed and then collapsed, 3 weeks shy of his 38th birthday. His assassination shocked the nation and galvanized the movement. Another influential figure was Malcolm X. He was a fiery advocate for Black empowerment and self-defense. His impassioned speeches and uncompromising stance resonated with many who felt dissatisfied by the slow progress of nonviolent activism. Though he too was sadly assassinated on February 21st, 1965, Malcolm X's legacy continues to inspire generations to fight for justice on their own terms. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, aka SNCC, was established in April 1960 during a meeting organized by Ella Baker, a civil rights activist and leader. This meeting brought together young activists who had participated in the sit-in movement across the South. SNCC's primary goal was to harness the energy and determination of young people to challenge racial segregation and discrimination through nonviolent means. Through sit-ins, freedom rides, and voter registration campaigns, SNCC activists bravely confronted segregation and voter suppression, often at great personal risk. Unlike the civil rights organization of the time, SNCC was unique. It had a decentralized structure with emphasis on student leadership and autonomy. SNCC would continue to play a crucial role in organizing and supporting sit-ins at segregated lunch counters, beginning with the Greensboro sit-ins in 1960. The sit-in protests spread rapidly across the South, challenging Jim Crow laws and practices. SNCC prioritized voter registration drives among African Americans in the Deep South, where discriminatory practices and intimidation tactics prevented Black citizens from exercising their right to vote. Freedom Summer was a landmark voter registration campaign in 1964, brought together by civil rights activists from across the country to challenge the disenfranchisement of Black voters in Mississippi. Despite facing intimidation and violence, volunteers worked tirelessly to expand access to the ballot box and empower marginalized communities. In 1964, SNCC participated in this Freedom Summer. The effort to register African Americans to vote in Mississippi faced violent opposition. Most notably were the murders of activists James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schorner. The committee also organized freedom rides in 1961, where integrated groups traveled by bus through the South to challenge segregation and interstate transportation. The freedom rides exposed the brutal reality of segregation and spurred federal intervention to enforce desegregation laws. Despite facing vicious attacks and arrests, participants remained steadfast in their commitment to challenge the racial injustice and advancing the cause of civil rights. Next, we are going to examine the Freedom Democratic Party. The FDP was a grassroots political movement that looked to challenge the exclusion of Black voices within the Democratic Party. The FDP emerged as a political alternative during the Freedom Summer campaign, with the goal of sending an integrated delegation to the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey. So, in 1964, the FDP challenged the all-white Mississippi delegation at the Democratic National Convention. They argued that the state's segregationist party did not truly represent the population due to the discriminatory voter registration practices. The FDP delegates, including SNCC activists like Fannie Lou Hamer, shout out, presented compelling testimonies of their struggles and demanded to be seated as the legitimate representative of Mississippi's African American population. While the FDP's challenge was ultimately unsuccessful in displacing the segregated Mississippi delegation, it highlighted the entrenched racism within the Democratic Party and continued to spur the support for voter rights reforms. SNCC's collaboration with the FDP underscored its commitment to political empowerment and representation for African Americans, laying the groundwork for future civil rights activism and legislative victories, including the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Along with demonstrations and voter registration drives, there were legal strategies. The legal strategies were integral to the civil rights movement, complementing grassroots activism and direct action. These strategies, often led by organizations like the NAACP, aimed to dismantle segregationist laws and secure civil rights through litigation and landmark Supreme Court cases. The NAACP was at the forefront of these legal challenges to segregation. The NAACP employed a systemic litigation strategy targeting specific laws and practices that perpetuated segregation. They argued cases in federal courts across the United States, seeking to establish legal precedents that would ultimately undermine segregation laws and foundation. Another tactic used during the civil rights movement was the manipulation of media and public relations. Media and public relations served as a tool to raise awareness of systemic racial injustice, to mobilize support for civil rights initiatives, as well as to expose the brutality faced by the activists. Through the strategic use of media coverage and televised events, civil rights leaders effectively communicated their messages to a national and international audience. Media coverage included newspapers, magazines, radio, and television, which was new at the time. The television was new at the time. It brought attention to the civil rights issues across the United States. Coverage of protests and marches and confrontations with authorities right there in your living room every night. Helped to galvanize public opinion and support for civil rights reforms. Journalistic coverage exposed the harsh realities of segregation and racial discrimination, highlighting the disparities and violence faced by African Americans in their daily lives. Images and stories of police brutality and peaceful protest resonated with the audience, generating sympathy and outrage. One event that was televised was the Birmingham campaign, organized by the SCLC. It utilized nonviolent direct action to challenge segregation in Birmingham, Alabama. Images of peaceful demonstrations, including children being met with police dogs and fire hoses, drew widespread attention and condemned segregationist policies. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, organized by civil rights and labor leaders, was also a pivotal moment in the movement. It was televised live as Dr. King gave his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech, which emphasized the moral imperative of racial equality and economic justice. Media coverage helped shift the public opinion in favor of civil rights reform. It influenced political leaders and policymakers to enact legislative changes. The civil rights movement's strategic use of media and televised events was instrumental in challenging systemic racism and advancing civil rights reforms. By harnessing the power of media coverage, civil rights leaders effectively mobilized public opinion, reshaped national discourse, and laid the groundwork for lasting social change in America and beyond. Despite the valiant efforts, progress was often met with violent resistance. The assassination of leaders like Medgar Evers and Malcolm X served as tragic reminders of the steep price to be paid in the fight for equality. These leaders and their diverse approaches reflected the multifaceted nature of the civil rights movement, demonstrating a range of strategies from non-violent protests to more confrontational tactics. Their collective efforts challenged entrenched segregation and injustice, leaving an enduring legacy of courage and determination in the pursuit of equality. The civil rights movement did achieve significant victories, including the passage of landmark legislation such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These legislative milestones marked important steps towards dismantling institutionalized racism and securing equal rights for all Americans. All right, y'all, that's it for this episode. Thank you for joining. I hope you learned something. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to drop a like and consider following the podcast for more content like this. As always, I welcome your feedback and suggestions for future topics. Until next time, peace.